Good day, afternoon, and evening, listeners and listless ears. If you're from where I'm from, then the world has turned to ice around you, and you found respite, like so many others, in the quiet comfort of a story. Does a fire crackle nearby? Do you and a hot beverage grip each other to stave off the wind? We don't have a story today, but a mystery told through stories. An urban legend. Some of our stories will be fictional, but too often they'll be stranger than fiction, scarier too, and always salient. Because they will be true, not works of the mind, but works of some past individual actions, recorded by the researchers and survivors. So join me as we talk about the truth behind cabin fever. It's April 12th, 1981 in the Sierra Mountains in California. The Shining came out last year. While spring does peek its head, especially later into the month, winter's hand still lays heavy on the houses and resorts in the small township of Keddie. A charming collection of cabins that's only an hour-and-a-half drive from paradise. 14-year-old Sheila Sharp was returning home, doing what so many of us do to pass life, watching movies at a neighbor's. No doubt excited for spring to bring back rustling shade and for apple blossoms to fill the air. And just like Alan Seeger who painted that picture for us, she had a tragic rendezvous with death. Returning home, she came to find a nightmare had replaced the dream she had left just yesterday. A bout of madness was in front of her. Her mother was on the couch, naked below the waist, stabbed. Her 16-year-old brother bound and throat slashed, and his friend Dana, just a year younger, had undergone significant trauma before being strangled. A victim of circumstance as much as the heinous crime 14-year-old Sheila Sharp was now standing in the wake of. She hadn't lost everyone, though. She had her brothers, Rick and Greg, their friend Justin. They managed to escape the insanity, spared the worst by being retrieved through the window of their bedroom where they had hid. Something was wrong, though. In all the carnage, 12-year-old Tina Sharp had gone missing. It's January 1982 in New York, New York. The Shining's slow rise to fame is gaining momentum, having utterly failed in the box office 2 years ago. It had now started to find commercial success. Back in New York, they're suffering through a winter whose severity won't be seen again for nearly another 40 years. Articles come out calling January and February's weather wild, crazy, and chaos. The Times comes out with an article combating cabin fever.
Besides frostbite and hypothermia, the devastating winter of 1982 is causing another malady, cabin fever, which affects temperament rather than temperature. In extreme cases, it can lead to violent and episodic behavior. It can happen after a week or more, or it can happen after 1 or 2 days of isolation. In extreme cases, people with cabin fever can become quite psychotic.
1983, and a young researcher named Stuart Grassian writes and publishes a study called The Psychological Effects of Solitary Confinement. His study goes over the seemingly binary outcome of solitary confinement, noting a restless banging, yelling, and assaultiveness in some, and a regressed, withdrawn, hypnoid state in others, as well as insanity among prisoners exposed to, quote, especially rigid forms of solitary confinement. While a considerable amount of prisoners fell into a semi-fatuous condition, others became violently insane. Charles Darwin, for example, observed inmates, quote, dead to everything but the torturing anxieties and horrible despair. The first man answered with strange kind of pauses. He fell into a strange stare as if he had forgotten something. Of another, why does he stare at his hands and pick the flesh open and raise his eyes for an instant to those bare walls? The literature goes on to describe the paranoid, confused states of psychosis with these symptoms. Extremely vivid hallucinations, including seeing and hearing things that weren't there, went as far as feeling and smelling things that weren't there either. Inmates would recover quickly, as, quote, from a dream, and coupled with amnesia around the events of psychosis, agitation with aimless violence, and delusions, usually persecutory in nature, often initially starting as a humming or buzzing, which then led to the hallucination. The specific psychiatric symptoms reported were strikingly consistent among the inmates. 7 prisoners were grouped together due to the peculiar circumstances of their solitary confinement, and out of 5 of them, their experiences were described as hearing voices, often in whispers, often saying frightening things, but usually the prisoner had no means by which to corroborate what they heard. I hear guards saying they're gonna cut it off, my nerve damage leg. I'm not sure. Did they say it, or is it my imagination? The study says that if they did say it, the prisoner is suffering from derealization. If they said something else or something not directed at him, he is suffering a paranoid perceptual distortion. If they said nothing, he's having a hallucination. There is no independent corroboration. I overhear guards talking. Did they say that? Yes, no. It gets confusing. I tried to check it out with a prisoner in an adjoining cell. Sometimes he hears something I don't. I know one of us is crazy, but which one? Am I losing my mind?
In one, the prisoner's illusions became complex and personalized.
They come by for breakfast with 4 trays. The first is big pancakes. I think I'm gonna get them. Then someone comes up and gives me tiny ones. They get real small, like silver dollars. I seem to see movements, real fast motions in front of me. Then seems like they're doing things behind your back. Can't quite see them. Did someone just hit me? I dwell on it for hours. I try to sleep 16 hours a day. Block out my thoughts. Muscle tense, think of torturing and killing the guards. It lasts a couple hours. I can't stop it. Bothers me. I have to keep control. This makes me think I'm slipping my mind. Lay in bed too much. Scare yourself with thoughts in bed. I get panicky thoughts, come back, and picture throwing a guard in. Lying eats away at his skin, his flesh. Torture him. Try to block it out, but I can't. Spaced out. Hear singing. People's voices. Cut your wrists and go to the Bridgewater. The Celtics are playing tonight. I doubt myself. Is it real?
This prisoner puts it maybe in the most horrifying way.
Your mind's narcotized. Sometimes I can't grasp words in my mind that I know. Get stuck. Have to think of another word. Memory is going. I feel like you're losing something you might not get back.
Interestingly, all prisoners interviewed reported having very rapid, usually within the first few hours, diminution of their symptoms during periods of relief. Meaning, as soon as they were re-socialized, a lot of these extreme symptoms would go away, and no correlation was apparent between the severity of the symptoms and the time required for them to subside. It's 1984, and the Journal of Social Psychology writes an article titled "The Meaning of Cabin Fever." And 3 years later, in 1987, the Washington Post releases another article titled "Cabin Fever in Space." With all of this happening in the 80s, you might be inclined to wonder if the Western world wasn't truly just one giant coked-out boomer made of the entire adult populace. With Stephen King's Mind Truths and Driving Disco being the head that sat upon a Goliath, which is somehow simultaneously spewing out and sucking up cabin fever, serial killer, slasher film, satanic panic, synth pop, and parachute pants. But as the Grammy Award-winning miracle wordsmith voice of a generation Billy Joel tried to explain, they didn't start the fire. You see, cabin fever was a term that gained traction in North America right around the early 1900s. It was used as a folk term, and so it's not something you'll find in research papers or studies too often. It got me thinking that if I wanted to go before the 80s, maybe I shouldn't be looking inside of cabins or prison cells at all. After all, those are just convenient places to feel stress and isolation. We've come up with plenty of those. What about shipwrecks? What about space shipwrecks? When we think of cabin fever at sea, we assume it's because the isolation and confinement is due to the fact that the boat itself is ostensibly a floating cabin surrounded by sharks. But when fate gets a bit gruff and decides to huff and puff and blow your boat to splinters, you're no longer in a floating cabin surrounded by sharks. You're just surrounded by sharks. And let us be clear, the size of the confines don't really matter, only that you're confined. As Kehoe and Abbott say in this 1975 study, the cabin, of course, may be a $50,000 4-bedroom home or a 1-room log structure. In this case, when you're confined to the ocean, the 4-bedroom home belongs to, one more time, sharks. So what happened in midnight of July 30th, 1945, when the Japanese huffed and puffed and blew the USS Indianapolis asunder? Here are some excerpts from the time at sea after the sinking. For context, the men have been in the water all night. Think of your skin after being in the water too long. Now imagine being stuck in the briny ocean for the entire time you slept last night. You're slicked in oil so your eyes sting, and your nostrils are filled with its sooty, metallic smell. But at least there's light now, as dawn breaks. Tiny glimmers of hope begin to surface. You see some groups of men have managed to find rafts. Some speak of sending a distress signal. And one sailor remarks that the power got knocked out, while another debates that the backup batteries had surely served their purpose, and the signal had been sent, and hope was found again. But that hope wouldn't last, or rather, the small ember that was left would have to be fiercely guarded by the survivors, guarded in the blistering sun and against cold nights, kept as their life vests swelled and constrained them, rubbing their skin raw under that hot sun, detaining them in that vast, briny void.
An unnamed seaman in one of the groups on that first morning found supplies in the wreckage and, in an attempt to improve their situation, separated from the group to grab a crate of potatoes nearby. He never reached it. And the survivors found one more thing to fray their sanity just a little bit further: sharks. Those sharks would remain as constant a form of pressure and fear as the sores and exhaustion. Within 50 hours in the water, most men spoke gibberish or hallucinated. They wouldn't be found for nearly another 50. And those life vests, which currently only made life a living hell, they were only meant to hold a person in the water for 48 hours. They began to slowly fill with water and became the ironic vessel which drove so many sailors to the very demise it was meant to protect them from. Dehydrated, exhausted, sun-blistered, starving, and scorned by nature herself, rubbed raw by life vests and sometimes drowned in them, witness to men being eaten alive, witness to men going mad. Is it any surprise then, confined to the ocean, surrounded by all these constant horrors, that eventually they turned on each other?
It consumed our reason, and in a little while we became a mass of delirious, screaming men.
Men who only a short time before had aided and supported their shipmates now saw the oil-covered, unrecognizable being beside them as the enemy returned to finish the kill. Though not every delusion was murderous, most were deadly.
I found her. The ship hasn't really sunk. She's beneath the surface. I swear she is.
Others gathered around him, and the seaman explained how the ship's fountains, called scuttlebutts, still worked and poured forth fresh water.
I dove down and turned on the scuttlebutts. Honest, I did, and it works. When you drink from it, the water is fresh. Fresh water, men. Fresh water.
While many took off their life jackets to dive down to the ship, Dr. Haynes saw the vessel himself. The only reason he didn't go is because some instinct prevented him from following. Lucid as he was, he could not stop others and dissuade them from diving under for that lethal drink. And listen, it didn't take all that severity either. Simply being shipwrecked on an island might result in murder. In The Archaeology of Crisis, Shipwreck Survivor Camps in Australia, quote, "There are instances of executions within survivor groups by hanging or marooning on small islands as punishment for real, perceived, or even invented crimes, or as a result of foul play. In these cases, bodies are simply left to decay on the surface." Though this isn't about ocean fever, I hope these illustrate how the confined nature of their situation, combined with the life-threatening stress that surrounded these individuals, makes for a sort of hyper cabin fever. Well, how about if your cabin's not floating at sea? What if the cabin's floating in nothing at all? Maybe you've heard this quote before. Freudian psychiatrists speculated that, quote, "separation anxiety from Mother Earth could lead to a pathological separation anxiety where the temptation to escape through suicide into oblivion may be accompanied by an urge to destroy the space vehicle and the rest of the crew." Like maybe you've seen it in a movie, or you've read it in a salacious headline. Or perhaps you've read that NASA reportedly has a system for duct taping and bungee cording distraught astronauts to keep them from destroying the entire crew. Well, it's not like it's never happened. You didn't think after over half a century of flinging ourselves into the great vast expanse we haven't had at least a couple horrifying close calls, did you? For instance, during the Salyut 6 mission, one cosmonaut became so enraptured that he made an unauthorized extravehicular excursion and forgot to attach a safety line, and was saved only thanks to the quick intervention by his fellow cosmonaut. Not to mention the time 2 space travelers refused to talk for 18 months outside of mission-critical exchanges. So we've looked at cabins at sea, commanded by hardened, salty sailors, and in space, manned by highly trained specialists. We've looked at tight little cabins we build to punish those society deemed inhuman enough to inhabit, and the cabins our circumstances sometimes force us to be confined to. But, if you've been observant, we haven't really looked at actual cabins yet. So what are the cases of cabin murders? Well, there's the Keddy murders that we talked about at the beginning, the Hinterfeichen murders, where a family was found dead in a small village in Germany in 1922, the Robinson family murders, where a family was murdered while vacationing at their cottage, and the Blue Mountain murders. Interestingly enough, there were 2 cabin murders in 2 places called Blue Mountain, just 1 year apart. In 2012, the case was a double homicide where the killer was actually killed in a head-on crash, resulting in his own death just 2 days after committing the crime. In the 2013 case, a man and his uncle were shot in a cabin by a relative. In fact, there's a whole listicle of cabin murders you can find here. But were they a result of cabin fever? Perhaps we should find a more refined definition of cabin fever than a New York Times articles from the 80s. Not only should we figure out exactly what cabin fever is, but when did it come into popular use? I mentioned earlier that it was in the early 1900s. But surely, the Western world didn't live in the snow for millennia and only come up with this description in the last 100 years. Seems we kind of did. So one last time. It's 1972, and two researchers are studying mental health of rural Canadians in the Yukon. They've come across something troubling. They've come across evidence that living in the harsh, unforgiving landscape long enough will actually drive some people to a state of mental extremes. Greater numbers of mania, a greater disparity of people suffering from schizophrenia, an improbably high rate of suicide and violent crimes. So they set out to investigate the root cause. In 3 years, they write 2 articles on the subject. 1972, The Mental Health Practice in the Yukon, and 1975, the more insidiously titled Suicide and Attempted Suicide in the Yukon Territory. They describe cabin fever as, quote, an insidious anxiety depression, which appears to be the consequence of prolonged confinement to a sensorily and socially monotonous environment, like an ocean or a jail cell. Their studies paint a picture of hard lives coming to hard ends, of older, longer residences taking their lives in more sure, more violent ways than their younger counterparts. That these acts of uncharacteristic violence weren't done to their loved ones and close friends, but rather because of an absence of having anything meaningfully resemble that support. In that study, published in the Journal of Social Psychology in 1984, they actually cite Abbott and Kehoe's work and describes the difficulty attributing the genuine medical diagnosis with, quote, folk terms. The authors interviewed a small group of Minnesotans and asked them about their personal experiences with cabin fever. They conclude that among those interviewed, cabin fever was distinguished by feelings of boredom, dissatisfied with being at home, irritability, needing a break from routine and restlessness. Other symptoms mentioned were frustrated feelings, nervousness or tension, impatience, depression, not accomplishing things, sluggishness, listlessness, moodiness, anger, and loneliness. I'm sure I get irritable at times and weepy or angry at my husband or blame him when I really shouldn't have. Another resident saying, I suppose you get maybe a little itchy or irritated at things that wouldn't normally irritate you. Another resident saying, I get very irritable, very short-tempered, particularly when dealing with my daughter, and I don't have the patience I usually have with her. I have more of a tendency, I guess, to withdraw inside myself rather than being outgoing and dealing with her. Sound familiar? So let's go back then, and examine those cabin murders just a little bit closer, and see if any of them are true, blue, bona fide, genuine cases of cabin fever. So what are we looking for? A case of involuntary confinement for some length of time, where tensions could be raised due to lack of food or water, or some other pressure, and of a case where violence was committed from within the family itself. While the Keddy murders remain unsolved, since Sheila Sharp had returned home from a neighbor's house to discover the crime, we can assume it wasn't bad enough out to force them inside. And besides, the Sharps had moved to relocate from a husband, and there's a neighbor who had suspicious circumstances surrounding them, like reports that they returned home late one night and burned something in a wood stove. The Hinterkaifeck murders, while interesting, were committed in March, which while cold, March in that part of Germany rarely falls below 0 degrees Celsius. The Robinson murders took place in the summer, so that rules that one out. What about the Blue Mountain murders? Well, Blue Mountain murder number 1 has a dead main suspect. That was from within the family. It wasn't done in the right time of year. But Blue Mountain 2, Electric Boogaloo, that's probably the closest we're gonna get. A 14-year-old shoots his foster father and his foster father's uncle before running off. However, upon closer research, we find that this case is suspect too. The foster mother is suing various adoption organizations for withholding, quote, troubling behavior from birth, despite the fact that they had actively renewed his 3-month stay and extended it 2 years, and were moving towards a full adoption. Plus, the kid shot himself in the leg during the escape, came back, pleaded for help, where he was duct taped to a chair, not exactly the work of a crazed criminal. Even that New York Times article didn't take itself too seriously. Tucked back in page 10, no bigger than an ad for mayonnaise, not even worth the time to spell check, even 40 years on. In fact, in all the jail cells and marooned ships and creepy cabins and shark-infested waters, I was only able to find a single case of what you might call a cabin fever murder. In 1972, at an Arctic research station, Mario Escamilla is told his raisin wine's been stolen from his quarters. So he does what any reasonably refined man does when his raisin wine's been stolen. He grabs a rifle to confront the thief. Only, the camp leader, who didn't steal the wine and instead tried to de-escalate the situation, was shot for his trouble. And even though The Shining and The Thing were on the cultural horizon, in this one case of a cabin fever murder, the focus wouldn't be on the way isolation could make you, quote, quite psychotic, but rather on the banality of land disputes, jurisdiction, and the different bodies trying hard to be picked last in the who gets the paperwork competition. The truth behind cabin fever is you don't find cabin fever murders in cabins at all. You find them in research stations and in clickbait headlines. That through starvation, isolation, the blizzards, the storms, the claws, the teeth, the scales, the scariest thing nature came up with was us. The truth is, we didn't need to be desperate or driven insane by weather to do what was done in Keddy, or do what we do to prisoners. Perhaps winter is meant to keep us with loved ones and away from our thoughts and each other. After all, it's worth noting that the cosmonaut I mentioned earlier wasn't in a state of mania or frenzy, but enraptured by Mother Earth, and all the beauty held in what Carl Sagan once described as our pale blue dot.